Amen. Now, somebody needs to measure out 2,000 cubits for me, please. Keep your distance. No, I'm kidding. Let's go ahead then. Now, this is the part we call the afterburn. So if you have comments or questions, you can raise your hand here. Zarek looks like he's going to walk around with the mic at this point, which is fine. Okay. And if you're online, Robert's got the online admin desk. And so we have that. And so you're welcome. Of course, let's try to keep the comments or questions. Now, Gadol class, you paid attention, right? You ready for your quiz? Okay, good. All right, so, and by the way, if sometimes we have one and sometimes we don't let that be a sign that maybe we won't always have one. You need to be ready all the time. Now, so what we want to do at this point is, I just want to look something up I think is interesting. Give me 1 second. I'm just out of curiosity. Where does it say what the dimensions were of the ark? 300 cubits. Okay, the length of it was 300 cubits. We know how big the ark was. That's a pretty big thing. So imagine 2,000 cubits. So I was trying to give you a right perspective. It says in verse 15 of Genesis 6, and this is how you make it. The length of the ark is 300 cubits, and its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. And we know that boat was immense. So now we're talking, well, no, how are we going to carry a 2,000 cubit ark? No, we're not talking about that kind of ark. But anyway, Noah's ark, okay, was 300 cubits long. We're told to stay back 2,000 cubits. That's 7 times bigger than the ark. I'm just saying, so when we're talking about it, we're not just talking about a few feet or a few yards. We're talking 2,000 cubits, 7 times the length of the ark. That protects you pretty good as far as meddling with that ark and meddling with that leadership. Just keep that in mind, okay? Because I knew if we could, yes?
Sorry, I was just going to go first so I can get their questions.
Okay.
I just had a couple of comments. At the beginning when you were talking about the 613 laws, I was reading an article earlier this week, and I was doing some research on something. And this article actually came out of the mainstream, but it was kind of interesting that he said that the Rambam and the early sages had spelled out 613 laws in the Torah. The Brit, or as he called it, the New Testament, spells out 1,050. So that was the first interesting thing, that they say that the burdensome law, the 613, and yet in the New Testament they found 1,050. The second part I found interesting was every single one of them actually refers back to the Torah. So every law given in the New Testament that they think they should follow actually refers back to the law they said is done away with. So that was, in doing his article, he actually supports following Torah. So that was the first comment that I just found interesting this week. The other one was at the end, when you were talking about in verse 4, keep your distance, don't go near that you may know the way to go. And I've used this analogy other places, and I've shared it with you before. In the military, it's like going into a minefield. If we're truly trying to follow our Redeemer, we're expected to follow in his footsteps. Not around his footsteps, not beside him. We step carefully in his footsteps, just like if you were traversing a minefield. You step in the exact footprint of the person in front of you. You don't deviate, because as soon as you deviate, you come out from that safe path, and that's where you're likely to go boom. So that's the kind of the picture I got, because as soon as I try to see where they're going to direct them, I've stepped out of the safe path that they've already proven is true.
Amen. Amen. All right, well, thank you for that. Okay, I just looked it up on my Google. It says, it's 18 inches approximately, 18 to 20 inches is a cubit. So 2,000 cubits is 3,000 feet, which is 1,000 yards, which is, so we're talking about, 10 football fields. Okay, so it's far, all right? We're talking about 10 football fields. It's 3,000 feet. is 2,000 cubits. So that's a lot, okay? I mean, if that measurement's right, they're guessing, nobody really knows exactly from the biblical time, but this is what they're guessing it at, is approximately 1 feet 6 inches. And so 3,000 feet is 2,000 cubits. That's, if you think about it, 100 yards, because 3,000 feet is 1,000 yards. 100 yards is a football field. That's 10 football fields. So imagine even being able to see the ark 10 football fields away. Okay? But you're not seeing the ark. You're seeing the ark in all the leadership, leading in front. And then the people then following from that point. Okay? Just to kind of give that to you. All right? Now, anybody else? What else we got question-wise? Okay, Michael?
Thank you, Rabbi Steve. Your lesson is on time for this week. My takeaway from the lesson today was verses 12 and 13, in which you learn to fear Yahweh, guard, and to do the word of instructions, and then know it, hear it, and learn to fear Yahweh. Mm-hmm. And then when to see, and I got the covenant, the priests, and the Levites, then you, ... And then recognize the burden of the ark and the burden of the leaders, and it's not void of any relationship. But my question would be, who are the officers? Were they judges? Because you had...
Probably the guys who were heads of the thousands, heads of the hundreds.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then in Yehoshua, verse 5, it says, set yourself apart. What did that look like? Was it a fast? Was it prayer? Was it meditation? Was it just a condition with the family? And
verse 5 of where?
Joshua, verse 5.
Now back in Joshua 3,
Yeah.
verse 5. Of course, I only went to verse 4, so I'm not obligated to answer the question. So we didn't cover that, so I don't have to answer it. So Joshua said to the people, set yourselves apart, for tomorrow Yahweh is doing wonders in your midst. Okay? What that physically meant, as far as setting themselves apart, it could be about fasting, it could be about mikvah, it could be about just getting your mindset set apart. Like, we're on a set apart day. You have to think differently on Shabbat. You have to get yourself ready for something. And so it's like what we should be doing on preparation day. We're getting ourselves ready for Shabbat, physically and mentally and emotionally. So he's saying, look, set yourselves apart, for tomorrow Yahweh's doing wonders. He's saying, get yourself ready. Prepare yourself for what Yahweh's about to do. How they did that, it's not necessarily clear. Okay? Where's the mic? Okay, Tricia?
Thank you. Mine are just mainly comments regarding what you spoke about, even before your service, about the wants and needs disconnect and being more simple. It was a confirmation and a covering for myself regarding a conversation that I had yesterday, and I just wanted to thank you and appreciate that, because that covered a discussion that Abba just used in such a timely manner. In regards to the ark, excuse me, and having such a distance, couple of things that I just wanted that came to remembrance was, if I remember and understand the scripture correctly, that even if you touched the ark, if you weren't one of the priests, that you would die. And having,
not just one of the priests, you had to be one of the Kohanes.
Exactly. And so having such a distance is Abba putting a fence to not only protect the priest and the Kohanes, but us as the people to keep that reverence and respect and have the fear of Yahweh for his word and in obeying in his commands.
Amen. Amen. Okay, Sarah Beth?
One comment and a question. Since the question kind of goes with what she said, the way it's worded in this rendition in chapter 3, it's almost like this is the first time this has ever happened. But like she said, there's been that command to not touch it, and you think about the children, the animals, and everything running up close. Why is it, Or is this even a relevant question? Why was this like the first time it was ever mentioned?
Well, it's not that. In this case, they're saying keep a very large distance as opposed to just being aware that it's dangerous to touch it. And so they would have been, keeping a reasonable distance of, a certain number of feet or yards or whatever. But this is actually, 1,000 yards. I mean, we're almost talking, 2/3 of a mile or something, or half a mile, And so that's a long distance. You don't need a half a mile to keep everybody safe from touching it. It really is much more about the following and letting it lead and seeing the entourage that was supposed to be following it and you getting in behind that and seeing how it's structured. Okay, so it's not changing the understanding that, you shouldn't be touching it, literally stay a few feet away from it, and that only certain people had the authority and the responsibility to actually carry it, which is why Uzzah gets killed, because he sees the ark on a cart, which it never should have been on a cart, and certainly it wasn't being carried and moved by guys who were supposed to be moving it, and when it started to look like it was going to fall and he touched it, he got killed, okay?
Second question, or comment, sorry. Growing up, I was in a group of people, and this happened multiple times, that, there was always people that were ahead of the leader, and the leader would change their mind on what direction they were going. And then that person, it just really bothered me, because then they were lost, and we didn't know where they were. So this was really, really, really programmed into my mind that you stay behind whoever's making the decisions of where we go, or you get lost. And I've really benefited from that programming, at least in the physical. I don't know about the spiritual, but there's been times, whether at the feast or here or there, that I always make sure I'm behind you. And there's been times you've changed your mind, and I know there's people that have missed whatever we were doing multiple times because they were ahead of you. And I just thought that was really very grateful I learned that lesson as a child.
Amen. I appreciate that. Yeah, we had a few of those at the feast where we were making decisions to go somewhere, and some of the people got ahead of the decision and the leadership, and they ended up in a place that we didn't end up. And that was not awful and terrible. This is, when you don't follow the structure, you don't end up where, then they're all looking like, well, why aren't you here? I said, what do you mean, why aren't I here? Why aren't you where I am? I mean, who said to leave and go before, And again, nobody necessarily was upset about it, just, these things happen. But, you have to learn to follow leadership. And it's just like when I'm going someplace that I've never been and I'm in somebody else's place, I expect to get in behind them, and they said, you lead, I don't know where I'm going. I'm going to follow you. And we try to find a person that knows where they're going and put them in front. Otherwise, we end up with that blind leading the blind thing. All right, who's next? Okay, go ahead.
So I've got two things. One, the Spirit brought something to my mind whenever he was asking his question about...
You got to put that mic right up there.
Whenever he's talking about verse 5 in Joshua 3, he asked how they would be set apart. And the Spirit brought to my mind, whenever Israel would move, the tribes would be organized in a certain way, and they would be set apart according to Yahweh's order before they would marshal out and move in their little formation. That's what was brought to my mind in terms of the way that they would set themselves apart by tribe and according to Yahweh's ordained order.
Okay, that's interesting. I'll say that sounds like a good. I like that. That's an interesting possibility in that situation.
Another thing was when the ark would move, if I recall correctly, Yahweh's presence would be with it, whether it was a fire or a column of smoke. And from 1,000 yards away, it would be easy to see if Yahweh was with the leadership. And there were many times that Yahweh wasn't, and they shouldn't have been following. And often he was, and it was very clear and evident. And that ties in directly with what you were talking about. In following your leadership.
Awesome. Excellent job.
And my last little point, is that Yahweh shows that good leadership leads from the front. They don't lead from the rear. They're always leading the way, and you lead by example. So those are the things that were brought to my mind.
Amen. Okay. The only thing that I would say about the pillars is that once they got out of Egypt, that was no longer the case. And so the leadership did go with the ark, and the ark went first. But you weren't dealing with the pillars as much anymore. That was really when they moved from place to place until they crossed into the land. But it had the right idea. They were learning that idea, from the example they had spent 40 years, following. Okay, who's next? Okay, Dawn?
Thank you, Rabbi. There's a couple things you said that I put question marks next to. You said if we're doing the Torah, I'm paraphrasing, if we're doing the Torah correctly, we will have shalom in our home, relationships, and work wherever we happen to be. So if we don't have peace, we're doing it wrong, or is it is there a litmus test to see if it's like the leadership? What's the fruit? Like, how do we test that? And how can we tell if it's the leadership or lack of us doing it properly?
Okay, I think that you got the whole thing I said twisted and inside out, okay? What I said was that a lot of people are so focused on trying to learn Torah, study Torah, understand Torah, that they're oblivious to the fact that there's no shalom in their home and there are other things that they're not doing. Because instead of applying it correctly, they're thinking they're spiritually minded because all they do is I study all the time and I pray all the time. But your family is a mess and your job is a mess and everything else. So I didn't say if you're doing the Torah, these things will not be a problem. We're still dealing with people. So you can all be trying to walk Torah out and still have issues at home, issues at work, issues at other places, issues in relationships. Some of your relationships are going to be a problem because you're trying to keep Torah and they're not, and they're going to make you have problems. My point had to do with people that are so focused and they miss the forest for the trees sort of thing, and they're not seeing that their house is a mess and they're not paying attention where they need to.
So heavenly minded, they're no earthly good.
Exactly. That's where that phrase comes from, okay? So it was about balance. Now, if you're a Torah observant, it doesn't mean everything in your life gets fixed. And if everything in life is a mess, it doesn't mean you're not keeping Torah right. Those are not direct connectors, which is what you were asking. They're not direct connectors, okay? There isn't a litmus test for that, no. You just have to get counsel. Okay, if things in your life, she said, is there a litmus test? I said, no. If you're having problems in any of those areas, then you counsel, and in counseling, we can see if there is a Torah problem or if it's just a relationship problem because we're dealing with these terribly hard to deal with things called people. Because we are miserably difficult to work with, okay? Because we are all too selfish and don't really know how to deal with others and our own needs and balancing our fears and our doubts and our insecurities and our paranoias and whatever. I mean, it's people problems, all right? And so often it has nothing to do with Torah observance specifically, but it has to do with just that we haven't learned how to grow up as people. And we haven't had good examples because we were raised by screwed up, dysfunctional people, and so guess what we ended up? It's just the way it is, all right? So we have to be the ones that say, it's going to stop with me. I'm going to get emotionally and physically and psychologically and spiritually healthy, and then my children are going to learn that from me, and we're going to change things here. But all of us are toxic and dysfunctional and broken and damaged. And so we can't be surprised that even if we're getting the mechanics of Torah observance down, that the relationship stuff still is a mess. All right? Okay, who's next? Robert?
All right, just a couple of pages. From Mark.
I thought I was clear. Why is there any questions?
From Mark, is it rebellion to vote? Are we bowing to the power of government instead of Yahweh?
No.
Okay.
Hold on, let me say this. Okay, because this is coming up in a couple of weeks with the midterm elections. Let me say this, okay? You are citizens of a country that has elections, and you as a citizen have a right to vote, and so you're welcome to do it. I won't have a problem with if you do or if you don't. It's your right, and you can do it or not do it. But what I want you to not do is get all hyped up emotionally thinking that if the right person gets in, everything's going to get fixed, or if the wrong person gets in, everything's going to go to whatever. That's, by the way, that's a spiritual technical term, like that. And that happens more with the presidential elections than with the Congress. But just realize that's the trap I don't want you to fall into. Don't become politicized and polarized by politics, somehow thinking that it matters. It doesn't in the big picture. It does in the short term. Maybe things might get a little better for a little while, or they may get a little worse for a little while, But that's not going to change the fact that it's all going down into the abyss until Yeshua shows up. So I don't want us to not vote. I don't care if you vote or not vote. What I want you to do is not get wrapped up into the hype of somehow it's going to make some sort of a real big difference ultimately. It may make some short-term difference. That's all it will do until the next guys get in there, or the next women, whoever it is, the next politicians get in there and they change it the other way. It's cyclical. It goes in ebbs and flows and does whatever it does. Ultimately, it doesn't tend to matter who gets in there. They end up, this agendas just seem to go forward no matter who's in there anyway. But just don't get caught up on that. I remember when this happens every presidential election. This is going to be the most critical decision because the whole, this person, if they get in there, is going to wreck everything or they're going to fix everything. And that's all nonsense. My book tells me that no human being is going to be elected to any position on this planet that's going to fix anything until Yeshua comes in and takes over the whole deal. And nobody's voting him in. There's not going to be any elections. And so I'm glad you asked the question, because we can get so hyped up in the politics of needing and desiring and getting all angry if your person doesn't get in or whatever. Stop that. This country is going to do better or worse as Abba decides to slow down or speed up the process that we're heading towards the abyss in. So he may allow some better people to get involved if he wants to slow things down. He may allow worse people to get in if he wants to allow things to get worse faster. It's just not really that relevant. In some ways, I hate to tell you, but your vote doesn't matter in the big picture, okay? But if you want your voice to be heard, and if you'd like things to be hopefully maybe better short term, sure, go ahead and vote. I would. If I thought there was somebody, if I voted for him, might make things a little better short term, I'd vote for them. No problem at all. Okay? I don't always vote. I don't always have a strong feeling that the person I'd be voting for is going to make any difference. So I'm not here to promote any candidates or any parties. I just don't want you to get hyped into the emotionalism of it. Because this country has done a very bad job of trying to make us polarized, rich, poor, black, white, and that hasn't worked as well as they maybe hoped it would, but they're getting a lot of traction out of left, right. Okay? The whole left, right thing is getting a lot of traction, is creating a lot of anger and emotion, and that's something I don't want you to feed into. Don't get caught up in that. I don't care which side you're on, left or right. If you're allowing it emotionally to get you all in, both are wrong. Okay? So thank you for the question. It's a good question, especially because we're getting close to these midterm elections, and both sides are making it sound like the end of the world is going to happen if their side doesn't win. The end of the world is going to happen no matter who wins at some point. Do we all understand that? So stop worrying about so much who gets in. It really doesn't matter to me. I trust in my Creator. He allows all those who end up in position to be in wherever they end up in the position because He allows it, because it serves His purposes in some way, and I'm not worried about it. But if I will feel better in my conscience that I spoke my voice and had my voice heard because I voted, then go ahead and do it. I vote sometimes. Sometimes I don't. Depends on if I feel like if that voice that I want to just to make sure that I had my voice heard. I gave my opinion. I get a lot of surveys, so do you. Like, you go do something, you get a survey in the email. Sometimes I'll answer them, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I want them to know my opinion, sometimes I don't care. That's all you're doing with your vote, is you're sharing an opinion. Okay, so if you want people to know your opinion, you want your voice to be heard, do it. All right, next.
Okay, from Anna Zimmerman. In Joshua 3:4, is there such a thing as being the voice of concern within the fellowship? If so, where's that fine line before crossing it?
No, if you have a voice of concern, then you approach leadership and you ask the leadership, how to handle whatever it is that you have concerns about. There is a process for that. And it's not Matthew 18 when someone sins against you, although people like to use that, although it's not a bad process to use. If you have a problem, issue, or some sort of concern, you go to your brother first, or you go to leadership first, okay? And you say, look, I'm seeing something that I think, that you need to be aware of, or maybe just to find out if the leadership is, how about that first? Ask the leadership first, are you already aware of this? because maybe they are. And if they are, and they're aware of it, and still they're going in the direction they're going, then you have to decide whether or not you want to go in that direction or not. Okay, like when people try to tell me about the moon, I'm totally aware of the moon, and I'm totally comfortable with our decision. Now, if that doesn't work for you, that's okay. Go somewhere else. You know, find somebody that's going in the direction you want to go.
Okay, from Anders Olsen, referencing keeping distance, he connected to, and a stranger who comes near is put to death in Numbers 151, 338, and 18:7. He would like to know if you could expand on the seriousness of applying this to how you read Joshua 3:4.
Well, look, we don't have the system and the courts and everything else to do any of this putting to death thing, or even necessarily putting outside the camp unless the person's actively causing a problem in the camp. So those are the things that would be like stoning offenses or other kinds of things. We don't have the system in place to do that, okay? All law has, within the law, jurisdiction, implementation, who can do what, who has the right to do what the process is, just like we call things here in this country due process. There's always a process. And so those things are not in place for us to implement them out in the diaspora, in the dispersion. So we can't actually address that. What we can address is how serious he thinks it is. Yes, he thinks it's serious. Okay, it goes across as being that. I want to go back to what Anna asked real quickly, though. I want you to understand that there absolutely should be and always should be a way to respectfully ask questions and have a position of dissent, because you may just find out in discussing it with your leadership that you were wrong. That would be helpful to know. Maybe you saw something and you didn't see it from the right direction or from the right place. And so it's always good that you know you have the freedom. This isn't a dictatorship or a cult or anything like that. To, if you have something that you don't agree with or you don't see the same, just go to your leadership respectfully and share with them, hey, this thing that you taught, I'm not seeing it that way. And I don't know why. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe whatever, but I just wanted to talk to you about it. Just be respectful. And that's the main thing. Because you may bring something up to the leadership that they didn't see, and that's good, and then maybe they'll make an adjustment. But you're not going there trying to say, hey, listen, you need to fix this because you're wrong. That's not respectful of the leadership. Be very reluctant to tell the leadership they're wrong. Go up and say, look, this thing that you said, I'm not seeing it the way you said it, and I'm just, want to make sure that I'm understanding it the way you meant it, and that kind of thing, and have a conversation. And let the leadership see that he's wrong or not. But I love the way that everybody wants to come to leadership and tell us how wrong we are. That, well, you did this wrong and you did that wrong, and this is not what that's not respectful. We put a lot of time and effort into trying to get the word across to you as best we can. And then we do something more difficult than that. We say it out loud from a microphone, which means that unless you're reading it word for word, you're going to say some things that don't come across exactly the way you meant them, because you're saying them and thinking them all at the same time. So unless, because I've had people come up to me, in years past, my wife would just say, well, you said this is this, you probably shouldn't have said that. And I'm like, you're probably right, but I'm up there just doing what I'm doing, and it's not as controllable as you might think until you come up and try this and see how quickly you trip over your tongue and say something you didn't mean to say. This isn't easy to do, and that's why a lot of people write it out word for word. And they just read what they wrote, because then they know they're saying exactly what they want to say because they wrote it out, looked at it, edited it, and made it what they wanted to say. And so that's where we end up in trouble, is that you have to understand free speaking in front of a mic is challenging. You're not always going to say things exactly how you wanted to get them to come across. And you'll make mistakes, and you'll have a little bit of a flub here or a little faux pas there, and it happens. Okay, who's next? Robert, more?
Yep. Thomas Losardo mentions that when you read Deuteronomy 31:28, Matthew 5:18 came to mind. He's wondering, is there a similarity? Right at the same time, Patricia Bogle posted the same reference correlation to Matthew 5:18 and said, the witnesses are still here, heaven and earth, showing us the Torah has not been done away with.
Oh yeah, no, there's definitely a correlation there. And there's a couple of places where, you can go all the way back into the Chumash, the first 5 books. You can go into the prophets. You can go into other places, into the Psalms, as well as into the Brit, and you'll see that reference to heaven and earth passing away. You see this in the prophets. You see this in lots of places. So yes, it's a consistent theme to say, just a reminder, folks, the heavens and earth are still here. This stuff is still valid. Okay? And so yes, but you see that consistently from Moses to the prophets, to the psalmists, to the writings, to the Brit. You see it all the way across. Okay, to the New Testament. So very consistent, that's. So seeing that reference there in Matthew 5:18 is a good reference, but there's so many of them. But by seeing it in Matthew, you see that it's still being reiterated and reminded to the people, hey, this is still going on. This is still valid. So it's good reference.
All right, from Bill and Elizabeth Rice. Another possible reason for staying back 2,000 cubits might be that the 3 million people could engulf the ark and nobody would be able to see it to follow it.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, you know, when you have everybody trying to get up front, there's only enough room up front for so many people, and the next thing you know, they start running over each other, and then next you know, who's leading, you don't know. And so you make a big enough gap, it's clear that there's supposed to be a gap, and we keep it that way.
From David Botwick-Reese, he had 2 comments. The first one being Deuteronomy 31:29 refers to the people being rebellious after Moses' death, but we know from Judges 2:7 that the people served Joshua. Shows intimacy of discipleship and the pupil process that Moses was referring to Joshua dying as his death.
Okay. I mean, look, the people had their rebellious moments even under Joshua, just like they had the rebellious moments under Moses. Okay, so I mean, they had the rebellious moments all the way across. And of course, things got worse when there wasn't a strong leader to try to impose order, so to speak. By order, meaning to keep the thing in front of their eyes. Moses and Joshua did a fairly good job of making sure that people said, hey, we're doing this. Let's not mess it up. Let's guard the commands. Let's keep focused. Let's keep our fear of Yahweh right. Other kings and other leaders didn't do such a good job with that, or actually actively led them in a wrong direction. And so that was also the problem there.
All right. His second comment was in Galatians 6:2 refers to us bearing one another's burdens, which completes the Torah of Messiah. Part of that is echoed in Deuteronomy 31:9, the burden by leadership to keep us on the path.
All right, let's be careful with this, okay? When we are looking at bearing one another's burdens and so complete the Torah of Messiah from Galatians 6:2, we have to be careful that we don't now somehow make the leap that the people being talked about here are now the same as those bearing the ark, or that they have the same burdens, or that somehow in completing something, it no longer needs to be done. What he's saying is, look, one of the things that is a fulfillment of what Torah is trying to get accomplished is that we bear one another's burdens. That's one of the 2 great commands, the part that's not vertical, the horizontal part, the loving one another. He says, so when we bear one another's burdens, we are fulfilling the intent of Torah on one level. So let's not confuse that, though, with the people who had a burden of responsibility to bear the ark. So now I think that's where we are tending to, kind of get our wires crossed a little bit. And that's, again, that's because the Christianese thinking, I'm not accusing this person of that, but there's that mindset that somehow we are now equating all of us to like the guys carrying the ark. No, Paul makes it clear, and Paul wrote Galatians as he also wrote Ephesians, that there are people who have certain roles like those 5-fold guys in Ephesians. That is not everybody. So let's just be careful we don't go into that thinking. So I don't see there being a particular linkage there, okay, between bearing the burden of the ark and bearing each other's burdens. Both of them are instructions that people had to do that was for specifically. The one in Galatians is for everybody. The one in Deuteronomy is for specific people. And that's where the difference is. All of us have an obligation and an opportunity to bear one another's burdens. And that does fulfill an intent, a desire, a purpose of Torah in loving each other. Okay?
Okay, from Brandon Tilton, just a comment. Just realized how much faith it would have taken for the leaders to walk that far ahead due to the tactical disadvantage it would have if there was a surprise attack from enemy force.
Ah, very good point. I like that. Thank you, Brandon.
And from Bernard, in Numbers 35:5, the measurement for the open land allocated to the Levites' cattle and livestock is also 2,000 cubits, the exact same measurement. Also, it's hinted at that the distance they had to camp away from the tent of meeting was also this same distance. Not what we know, but what are... Okay, I think that was running into a different question. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bernhard. Bernhard's down in South Africa. Appreciate that.
Mark's has a question. Could the ark be likened unto Paul saying, "Endure the race," as the ark is the finish line?
I don't think I would make that leap, but, enduring the race is to be more the idea of getting into the kingdom and crossing into the Jordan, into the land. The ark is the vehicle. It bears the vehicle of getting there. Okay, but the ark leads. In other words, this is the goal, is to be, it's like when we follow Yeshua, you're following the ark. That's the better analogy. Yeshua is the full embodiment, just like the ark embodied, physically, literally embodied the Torah. Yeshua did the same thing. He was the physical embodiment of Torah in its ultimate sense, and we follow him because he's leading us into the kingdom. So I don't know that I would link it to the race or to, the way you did. I'm not saying it's wrong, I just don't think I would do that.
Okay, the last thing I have here came from Jonathan Thompson. Were those who followed Yeshua at a distance demonstrating this understanding of Torah and the ark?
Look, my memory of the few places where it says they followed him at a distance were people that weren't sure they wanted to follow him. I think that was where the phrase was mostly in the New Testament, that these then followed him at a distance because they just didn't want to necessarily be associated with him and they weren't sure what their levels of commitment were. So no, I would say actually probably the opposite. That they were doing it from a distancing themselves from as opposed to setting apart the distance because it's Torah. All right, is that going to do it? All right, I'm sorry, Daweed?
I just had one other point that someone made the question, something about the distance having something to do with the stranger shall not come near. So that got me thinking, were the people of Israel considered to a certain extent strangers at this point in time? And I looked back and said, well, there was a point in time at this relative period of time that they were circumcised again, which means that they weren't circumcised at a certain point. And I looked at the chronology of it, and yes, indeed, they were circumcised after they crossed the Jordan in chapter 5, verse 2, starting from there. So that might have been also part of the point of them being that far distant, being that you shouldn't be coming near because you're not circumcised yet.
I'll have to think on that. I'm not so sure, but that's an interesting thought. I'll have to think on that. Okay, Zarek?
Similar to what my dad was talking about, but different type of military thing. With us, when we go into nighttime driving, tactical training, specifically the training part of it, we tell people, okay, we're getting ready to drive. It's midnight, there's no lights, and we're fixing to turn our headlights off and drive with night vision goggles, which take away all your depth perception. And we're driving big 16-ton vehicles. So, stay back, because the person in the front who knows the route might still have to make a sudden stop because something popped up on the route, because we're also driving through the woods. And there's animals that love to just jump out in front of vehicles. And unfortunately, something this big, such as the nation of Israel, doesn't stop on a dime. So if you're right behind me and I have to stop, you're going to slam into me. And if you're right behind someone who's behind me, you're going to slam into them, and then they might slam into me.
Good point. Good point. Thank you. All right, bring it back to your father. Now he wants another comment.
I'm sorry, this might relate to following the pattern exactly, but a little thing about that depth perception. The night vision drive, when the single dot turns into 3 dots, you know you're about to smash it. So that's the giveaway that you're too close.
All right, there you go. That's the night vision trinity. I'm joking. All right, now I started it. And when the one dot becomes three, you're about to get smashed. All right. There must be a metaphor in there for the whole thing. But anyway, anybody else? All right, let's go ahead and get the children. Well, I hope this is making some sense. I hope everybody's kind of getting it. I think that this is, I think this is probably, as much as I love the heart of the matter, I might end up liking this just as much, if not more. I mean, it's just that next piece that we have to really focus on is this idea of being covenanted and how serious it is to Yahweh and how much it keeps coming up, and understanding our role in interacting with it, the leadership's role in interacting with it, and all of that. I think is. And I really like that piece in Joshua. I almost wasn't going to even bother with that piece in Joshua. It's only a couple of verses, but I really like that idea of seeing the ark and the priests who were bearing it and setting out and following it and keeping a distance and understanding what that all means. Shabbat shalom! Shabbat shalom! We love you! We miss you! Thank you.
I had a phone call from heaven right now. Came out of nowhere. Yeah.